Hi, Jeff. Excellent. Thanks so much. Um, so good morning, everybody. Before I get going here, Secretary Clark, anything you'd like to say to kick us off today before I walk through our agenda?
No, just a good morning and welcome everyone to the conversation. I look forward to today's discussion. Just so folks are aware, unfortunately, I have to step away in the middle for a meeting, but we'll be back on after that.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. So why don't I show off the agenda here? It's kind of meaty today. And so let's just walk through it and make sure we're all comfortable with what we're trying to do today. We'll have some usual business here to approve our minutes. The first thing we want to do right out of the gate is look at the outlook for this meeting and the next 4 meetings to the end of March to see if that makes sense. The steering committee, our steering committee already looked at this and provided some input, so we'll show you that. And we want to agree on that. And then we also want to look at an approach to public comment that the steering committee looked at last week, and we've made some adjustments to that. It's the version, if you remember, there was a version we looked at in December, or even the previous meeting, and we've made an updated version of that specific to the council that incorporates some thinking. So that we want to do right out of the gate. Then Sophie from the Climate Action Office we'll be doing this at all of our meetings, but we'll be showing a summary of public comments received since our last meeting. And we're going to do that because we get comments in through the website, through other ways. And so we're just going to make a habit of doing that. And sometimes we'll put it at this place in the agenda. Sometimes we'll put it a little lower down, closer to public comment. Then we're going to have 2 blocks of discussion around priority actions. And thank you for those of you who provided some input on that temperature check survey I sent around. And I'll walk us through that when we get there, how we're going to focus our time on those priority actions based on your input. After a break, you as a council do need to approve a report to the legislature. The steering committee already looked at a version of this. And Jane will walk through that report. And our goal is if there are comments and concerns that we agree on a set of notes where we all can say, oh yeah, make these changes, please. If we can get that far, that'll be the way we approve the report today. We'll do public comment 12:50. We're going to be talking at the top of the meeting about changes, a little bit of changes to public comment. And so we'll hold that for about 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes, although it looks like it's only scheduled for 10 there. So we will do 20 minutes of public comment. Something glitchy happened in the agenda. We'll do a second block of discussion around priority actions. And then we'll finish up by looking at the writing assignments and approach to writing chapters that the steering committee's looked at a couple times. And I think you've looked at once as well as a council. That's it. We'll end at 2. Okay, so before we dive into this agenda, any quick questions about our agenda, concerns how we're going to use our time today? Great. Well, let's dive into it then. We need to approve minutes. I'll give folks a moment to click through if you need to. It's right here. You can click right through. I'll just give folks a moment.
I'll make a motion that we accept the minutes from the prior meeting as presented.
Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate that. And we do a sort of a loosey-goosey version of Robert's rules here in the sense of it's helpful to have a motion like that. And what we do is say, I'll ask if anybody needs more time, and I'll ask if anybody has concerns. And if we don't hear concerns, we'll treat them as approved. But thanks, Michelle, for jumping right in there.
One thing to note, David, I don't see my name as an attendee on the list, so maybe I could just be added. I was at the 16th meeting.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Any other issues or concerns about the notes?
Just when the vote, this is Carrick, just when the vote is taken, just make sure it's that I abstained. That's all.
Okay.
Please, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, concerns? And so I think for folks, it's the way we were doing this is, if anybody needs more time, now's a good time to shout out. If anybody has any concerns, now's a good time to shout out. If I don't hear requests for times or concerns, we'll treat these approved. We don't need to actually vote on it. So any concerns before we treat these approved? Great. We'll fix the missing name. Thanks for that, Secretary Clark. Okay, great. So let's dive into that first item on the agenda, which is the meeting calendar. I'm going to pull this up on my screen. This is something the steering committee looked at, and I'll encourage steering committee members to chime in to help supplement what I'm going to say, or if Jane's here and wants to say anything. But this is something we developed with and worked through with the steering committee last week, I think, last Monday. And what it really tries to do is give us a pathway to reach a draft updated climate action plan by the end of March. Because that's the goal, is that we have the draft core content of the updated climate action plan by the end of March, so that in the month of April, there could be a lot of proactive engagement around that draft plan, which is, for those of you who were around last time the council did this, we didn't get that spot. We didn't get a draft plan out for public comment and feedback. And that's what we're really trying to do this time. Okay, so the way to do it is today we're having our meeting. We're going to focus on reflecting back on the priority actions we heard in December. I'll use that little survey mechanism as a way to focus our time. So that's what we're doing. We also need to approve a report to the legislature with whatever edits you all as a council need to see, confirm writing assignments, and then we're going to talk a bit about public comment in just a second. So that's this meeting. Now, what changed in the steering committee meeting is we talked about making our next meeting in person. And steering committee members felt that if we're going to make the effort to drive and be in person, let's make it a longer meeting and not do like a 3 or 4 hour meeting. Let's do a proper like 5 or 6 hour meeting. And so we are proposing here, and the steering committee's on board with this, is our next meeting in January in a couple of weeks. We do that in person. Liz Amler is working on the location. It's likely going to be in Montpelier. And we do that in person, and we do our deep dive into the full suite of recommendations coming out of subcommittees. We're going to include some reading time in that. We're going to work on specific issues that counselors really want to work on and believe we need to spend some time on. And we'll probably do some time to connect as a council as well, because we really haven't spent much time in person. We're about to do something very challenging, which is try to reach agreement on an updated climate action plan. So that's later this month. In February, virtual, and everything here that says virtual, I understand they're starting this year. There will be an in-person option. If members of the public want to come somewhere in person, there will be a place where they can come. And maybe that's why your hand went up, Liz and Jane. So when you see virtual, know that that also means there is an in-person option for those who want to attend in person. February 10th, we're going to focus on the Cap and Invest study and its implications for the climate action plan. We can provide an update on the other study that's going on, which is the business as usual study. And we can offer some guidance to the writing groups that should be, deep in it at that point, starting to really write up things. March 10th, early March, just one meeting in February. And then in March, come back in person and really start to review draft chapters. There's a March 1 writing date we'll look at later for draft chapters, for most draft chapters. And so by March 10, we want to be reviewing those, trying to understand the kinds of edits and things that you as a council would like. We also need to make sure we're clear about how we're going to use our guidance document, our decision-making protocols and things to sign off on the version that goes out to public comment, just so everybody's on the same page there. And then finally, in March, let's meet virtually. We can look at this, the modeling that's been coming out that won't be ready until then. And then we'll do an exercise to sign off on materials for the April public comment. Okay, so that's me walking through it. I see Liz and Jane, you've got your hands up. Although I see you walking out of the room right now, so maybe now's not a good time. But in the room there, Liz, if you all want to jump in, please do. There seem to be some technological things happening there. Okay.
Sorry, Jane here. Now that we're having these in-person locations, there's actually members of the public coming down to meet with us. So we're sort of still getting used to that.
Got it.
David, my apologies for jumping in and unclear because we were signing on and getting set up, but we have 3 new counselors today, and I just wanted to make sure you had provided a space at the top for them to introduce themselves.
I did not. I raced right into it, and I'm so glad you stopped me.
Yeah.
Jane, can you help me with that?
Yeah, we have a new administration appointment, Commissioner Carrick Johnson, who is taking the place of June Tierney at the helm of the Public Service Department. Once I introduce folks, I'll pause for you all to say anything if you'd like to jump in. We also have 2 new legislative appointments, David Mears, who's representing Resilience, and Dahlia Cohen, who is representing the youth seat. Both David Mears, you'll all recall, was involved in the first climate action plan as a subcommittee member. So he's coming in a little bit wet, which is great. And Dahlia also, who's been benefiting by serving on us on the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. So just wanted to acknowledge their presence since they have voting rights and give them a space to introduce themselves if they'd like.
Thank you, Jane. Carrick Johnson, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I know many, if not most, virtually all of you in some way, shape, manner, or form. Grateful to be here. I would also be grateful for your forbearance as I catch up to this moving train. And there's a lot of moving parts, but looking forward to be a active participant and see what we can get done. Thank you.
Thank you. So glad you're here. Dahlia?
Yeah, hi. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's nice to see all of you. Yeah, same thing. I think it'll take a little bit of time for me to kind of find the right pace, but I'm so looking forward to contributing to this meaningful work. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dahlia. And David?
Thanks, David. Yeah, David Mears, looking forward to working with all of you. Thanks.
Excellent. And all the more reason to be in person in 2 weeks and actually start to gel as an expanded council. So I'm really glad we have new folks on board as we head into this critical moment. And thanks, Jane, for stopping me to do that. Okay. So in terms of the meeting flow, I'd be happy to put back on the screen that meeting flow. Steering committee members, anything else that you'd want to say that I didn't share as I walked through it, you thought that was important from our meeting last time? Kelly?
I dropped it in the chat, but I wanted to make sure it was clear because there was a concern raised by a member of the public that we would no longer have a virtual option when we have in-person meetings, but we will continue to have a virtual option so that folks who can't travel to our location or don't want to or whatever they can. But I think the idea is that any council members are strongly encouraged to attend in person, but members of the public and people who are snowbound and can't get here will have the option for virtual.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Anything else in terms of the meeting flow? Counselors, how does that sound? Any concerns you might have if you're just looking at this for the first time? Okay. Great. All right. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time together in the next 3 months, next 2.5, 3 months. So, let's get to know each other a little bit better. All right. So with that, if I'm not hearing concerns, let's treat that as our roadmap through March. And we will plan the meetings accordingly. Expect updated invites from Liz Amler with the location if it isn't already in your calendars. I actually haven't checked mine. And expect that we'll really spend quite a bit of time together in those 2 in-person meetings. Okay, great. So then the next piece to this that we wanted to do right out of the gate is around public comment. And this is something, the subcommittees adopted public comment that was guidelines that was recommended coming out of Just Transitions. subcommittee, you as a council looked at it. We paused on actually adopting it because the document really didn't fit the council perfectly. And then we had some experience in the December meeting of, reminding ourselves that actually we can have quite a bit of public comment. So we need to figure out a way that's going to work for you all to get the comment that's going to make this a better plan, while at the same time having predictable sort of amount of time on agendas and things like that. And that's what prompted this latest version. And I'm just going to sort of walk through this. And if Sophie's here as well, I would welcome your help, Sophie Deltrop from the Climate Action Office, and Kelly Klein, obviously from a Just Transitions subcommittee standpoint, please jump in anytime. But what this document tries to do is provide a little traceability. First of all, that Just Transitions has sparked this thinking of like, how do we do effective public comment that's meaningful and respectful of people's time and everything. And so, and there's a purpose behind this, right? Strong public comment practice results in a better process, a better product, and a plan that's more inclusive of Vermonters' voices. So what we try to do here is say, in the context of public comment in a meeting like this, there are a lot of other avenues as well for Vermonters to be part of this process and weigh in, right? So the website, there's a website, there's a voicemail box, and there is a log of all those comments on the website. And maybe Liz or Sophie, if you get a second to drop that link in the chat, so everyone can see those comments coming in. And as you can see in today's agenda, we're going to have a little moment to review what's come in. And we can't do word for word usually if it's a lot, but we can do thematically. These are the kinds of comments that have come in, and we'll make sure you have a link to do your own reading as well. There's going to be significant input received through the process that we've talked about previously, that the Consensus Building Institute is doing with the Climate Action Office, of reaching out to populations that aren't typically involved in these processes, populations maybe that are at the front line of climate impacts. So we've been doing that for over a year, and we'll continue to do that, and we'll continue to bring that content to you as a council, and we make those quarterly reports as summaries of that. And obviously public comments like what we're talking about today is the third way that's throughout. We also want to note that in April, there will be a significant effort to go out in person and virtual to reach a large number of Vermonters about the draft plan. So that's coming, and that's a major thing that's happening. And your meetings in May will really be focused around how do you digest, listen to that content. Okay, but now we get to the part about comment. And this is sort of how do you do this in a good way for you as a council? And the idea is when to do it. And we think in principle, this is coming right out of the Just Transition Subcommittee. Public comment should be after there's been information presented in initial discussion, but before final decision making, so that it can have an input into final decision making. You all are going to be doing a lot of deliberation over the next few months, and not a lot of decision making until the end of it. So this is a little bit more fluid for you, I think, for the coming months, because you're not making a ton of decisions as you go. But in principle, it should be what's here. And in practice, we'll see how that works in our agendas. Similarly, agendas may have one comment period like we're going to do today, or multiple if there's really discrete decision points that are important, sort of like more final-like decisions that you'll make. And then the amount of public comment time, a predictable 20 to 30 minutes. So folks know we're not doing 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And I don't know what happened on the agenda this time that it popped into 10 minutes. I think there was a little rewording of there, and we'll fix that. As I mentioned at the top of this meeting, our request is that counselors keep their cameras on during the meeting, and the public keeps their cameras off until the public comment period. And there is this piece coming out of Just Transitions. If we're working on a document, we should make sure there's plain language in that document or a version of that document. Okay, and then finally, the piece here that I want to mention is we think it's going to be important to stick to a 2-minute limit on public comment in meetings like this. And we think it's also important to stick to the allotted time on the agenda. And if folks still, we have lots of hands raised after that, we'll be directing folks to put their comments in through the website or other ways. And those comments will be summarized and brought back to the council in the subsequent meeting. So stick to the allotted time, stick to 2-minute limit. And there's one here, if there's a lot of hands raised at the beginning, the facilitator, i.e. me or whoever's facilitating, will make an effort to call first on folks who haven't been commenting in previous meetings. Last thing I'll say here is about responding in real time. There's been a big request from public commenters to get responses from the council in real time from what they're saying or asking. And it's super tricky, you as a body of 23 counselors, to do that in an efficient way in real time. So I just think it's helpful for us to set an expectation that that's a very difficult thing to do. At the same time, if there are direct questions where there can be straightforward answers and there's an ability to answer them, you all or the Climate Action Office should be answering those after a public comment period. But the expectation that somehow you as a body of 23 can come with like a consolidated answer on every point that public comments brings up is a very tricky thing. Okay, I think that's it. There's more here. If folks want to look, there's a little bit more detail here. We've talked about this previously. And this is working with partners. Could we lift up voices if we wanted to bring voices of marginalized communities or other communities to the council, work with partners to make that happen? Always include a summary of public comments in the meeting notes. There's this piece about if commenters want a follow-up and counselors are interested in that to help facilitate that in the moment. And obviously thanking people who are going to invest their time to provide input to all of you. Okay, that was a lot. Let me just pause and say questions about this, doubts about what's being suggested. Any questions or doubts about what we're suggesting for public comment? Any friendly amendments to what's written on the page here do you think that would make this better and more appropriate for your needs? Okay. Thanks, Chris, in the chat. Any concerns before we adopt this and consider this adopted? Okay. So without hearing concerns, let's adopt this. We'll practice it today, see how it goes. And thanks everyone for adopting that approach. And thanks steering committee members for providing input on that. Okay, that's that. Chris?
Hey, not to be a fly in the ointment here, but do you want to take public comment on that before we seal it with our approval?
I was not planning on doing that. And
Okay.
I think we will have a section of public comment if folks have opinions on it. And then you as a council would like to revisit based on those opinions. I'd be more than happy to revisit this based on opinions that folks say. But for right now, we're not going to take public comment on this document. Okay. Next thing up, if Sophie's here, we were going to do a summary of what's come in of comments. And Sophie, over to you.
Hello.
Uh-oh. Someone's got to mute one of the two things.
Okay.
Try muting yourself, Sophie.
Oh, great. Is this better?
That's it. You got it.
Okay. All right. We won't be able to hear them. But yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. David, do you have a preference and can you give thumbs up or down on whether I share my screen to go through the comments? Yes, okay. Right. Let me get to the top of this. So, while you all have or will be adopting the public comment guidance, this is kind of an example of how that written portion will go of summarizing written comments. So gives you a little feel. I will name that these are comments that came through October, from October through December. So there's a big chunk of them. And, you know, as your meetings ramp up through these next few months, it'll be like a smaller amount. So I'm going to go through these in a really succinct manner. But there could be the potential in future meetings for, you know, if there's only a couple comments, they could be read in whole or in part. But I'll just go through these and kind of summarize the comments that were received. Hopefully you all have had a chance to take a look at this. We did put in the topic areas that the comment pertains to. So if you have a particular expertise and want to really hone in on those comments that are most relevant to you, you're able to do that. The document is 13 pages long, so that hopefully can help you prioritize. And if you haven't had a chance to read yet, that's okay. Like we said with the November comments from that massive engagement summary that we handed you all, that, you know, is an ongoing tool and resource for you to refer to as you do your work over the next few months. So if you haven't had a chance to sit down with either the engagement summary from before or these comments yet, there's certainly still time for that to be the case. So I'll just run through these to share what we've received in written comments. And that link that I put in the chat just a little while ago brings you to that public comment log. So we had comment about buildings and thermal that touched on residential building codes and smart panels, embodied energy, how to manage peak loads. And we've got several comments that came in related to flood recovery and housing. This one's from a long-term recovery group, and they included a document they've been using with the legislature, a comment on concerns about electric vehicles, comment on considering the housing crisis in decisions that are being made at the Climate Council level, and the link here to Vermont's point-in-time count, which is done annually as assessing the state of unhoused Vermonters. Comments about off-grid residents being able to access certain options for electricity and converting to electricity as a home heating option and the challenges there. We had a comment coming from Kingdom Trails, which is biking trails up in the Northeast Kingdom that has to do with rural economic development and recreation and lands associated with that. Comment on relate to policy choices around Global Warming Solutions Act and focusing more on flood resilience. This comment came in after the business focused input session and touched on a range of issues that all relate to businesses and living in Vermont and economic opportunity. Comment in support of e-bike programs. Comment on buildings and thermal related to the Affordable Heat Act, or what's the name of Clean Heat Standard? Yeah, Clean Heat Standard, also known as. Comment about what could make this plan more helpful for municipalities and local planning. Encouragement to look at the Forest Stewardship Council certification and its overlap with climate resilience. A comment from a forester on natural and working lands after the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee listening session. Thinking about population in Vermont over time and Vermont's impact on the climate in context. Another comment on affordability and the consequences of climate policy decisions on affordability, both that one and this comment right here. Then a question of thinking about zoning in concert with transportation and impacts there, specific to this person's neighborhood. And then actually, I think I missed, there's another part of this comment that I neglected to put in here. So you can find that on over in that whole public comment log that I had posted in the chat over there. But I know this, oops, wrong one. Sorry about that. No, there we go. But comment about the soil's potential to help us in our goals for carbon storage and supporting healthy soils. Comment about current use program and what kinds of forest management are allowed within it. And further comments on logging and mature forests. This comment pertains also to logging and forests and the intersection with biomass. And then this is an extensive comment related to buildings and thermal and overlapping with equity and justice. And there is a longer document with that from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. 2 comments on composting and thinking about waste. Again, diesel emissions from trucks and the relationship with zoning there. And then this also pertains to mature forest and encouraging the power of lands to sequester carbon. Support about the electric vehicle incentives and hope for that to continue. This is some responses to the Buildings and Thermal Subcommittee input session. Support for moving away from fossil fuels and seeing wood heating as an option for that. A comment from somebody who's on their local energy committee and some of the things that they've done and some of the lessons they've learned as a result of that work. Thinking about preparing buildings for flooding and more resilience needed there. Also concerns about electric vehicles in this comment. Thoughts about biofuels and relating to heating buildings, but then also not just heating buildings, but also comments on the McNeil plant in Burlington, which generates electricity. And then finally, thank you for your patience and going through all of these. This is from the Northern Forest Center wrote in a comment letter. So that pertains to national and working lands. And finally, Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission staff composed a letter together that has several points on the transportation sector. So I'll stop my share there. I went through those, trying to make that succinct. Hopefully you can take some time to dive into any comments that particularly stood out to you. And I think at this point, we're going to put it to see if there's any interest in discussing any of the things you've read. And
Thanks, Sophie. Okay. Yeah, Rich?
Just a quick comment. I appreciated the summary that you prepared. I enjoyed reading it. I found the comments to be really, thoughtful. And so I think this is a good practice. So thanks for doing it.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. Other reactions or anything folks would like to say, having just walked through that quickly? Okay. And it's a lot being asked of you as counselors. And I think to the extent you can invest some time in reading, reading through comments, obviously reading through all the pathway strategies and actions that are coming out of the subcommittees, there's going to be a fair amount of reading time that you're going to be asked to do. And so I just thank you in advance for investing that time. JL?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if in the summary document, it can be put together by topic. I just saw a bunch of different topics, just as like an ag and ecosystem co-chair, so I can take note for those topics.
Thanks, Jill. And Sophie, I hope you're hearing this. If yeah, you are. Okay, great. And I think sometimes it's tricky because you have like a single comment that has a bunch of stuff in there, right? But in general, it sounds like you've already done the hard work, Sophie, of sort of putting a subject line and the kinds of content that's in there. So maybe it's just a question of the way that docs ordered to try to the extent possible, try to order those up based on topical areas. Okay. Anything else, counselors? All right. Great. So we'll make that a habit of looking at them, and hopefully you can make a habit out of doing a deeper dive, particularly in the ones in the areas where you really want to lean in and focus your substantive attention. All right. Next up, you all in December got sort of like a fire hose amount of priority actions from subcommittees. I think it was somewhere in the range of about 50. And thankfully, many of you responded to the request to help me focus how we might have some additional conversation today about those priority actions. The goal there was really to try to figure out where you as a council feel like you really need to spend some time discussing or bringing additional information to the table, or otherwise leaning into issues that aren't necessarily ready for you all to say, oh yeah, let's put that out as a draft set of actions. So let me share my screen here. We're just going to spend, let me go back to the agenda for 1 second to see how much time we have here. Is 1 second. So we'll go up to 12:15 to do this. Oops, wrong thing. Sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. So thank you for 10 of you filled out that survey mechanism. Some of you tried to fill it out and had some difficulty with it. So there's a few more there. One of you did it this morning after I'd done this slide deck. So it's a few more that have either tried or did it since I pulled together this deck. So thank you for all of you who spent some time. It was a beefy, 50 or so priority actions to weigh in on. What was interesting to note, if you haven't looked at it, there was sort of, for each of these priority actions, there was 3 options, which may have felt a little limiting, but it was kind of a forcing mechanism. And the 3 options were, basically looking okay or looking good. The other was like looking good, but I have some comments that I'll put in the box. And the third one was, this needs more discussion. And in parentheses, it said, I have serious concerns. And what was interesting when going through the results was none of the actions received more than 3 mentions of, this needs further discussion. I have serious concerns. So to some degree, you can say, wow, that's a positive outcome that for those who answered the survey, there's a lot of, in many of these things, there's a lot of sense of we're on the right track here. Also, many of you provided thoughtful comments when asked to do that. So thanks for that. And we'll be summarizing those comments and pushing them back out thematically for your next meeting as well. Okay. What were the areas where you had like the most numbers of, hey, we need a discussion on this? This is what came up. A couple on the buildings and thermal, that first recommendation around a mechanism, and then other pieces of buildings and thermal, and I'll show you in a second. Those came up, were noticed a couple times. Transportation, the cap and invest, the number 1 recommendation was noted several times. A recommendation around changing the way the greenhouse gas inventory happens for agriculture got several mentions. Also in Ag and Eco, there was a recommendation around redesigning the state education funding model that got a number of recommendations, or excuse me, a number of flags of, hey, we need a discussion about this. And then the biomass piece got a number of mentions as well. And as folks remember on biomass, there was like a multiple thing that came out of the subcommittee on that. There were some other ones that had more than one mention of let's have a conversation. These are some of those, in Ag and Eco, the support the robust funding for supply chain resilience and state food security. These are abbreviated versions of those recommendations, by the way. Those are all longer sentences. And then this other one around ensure that the Vermont food supply is sufficient to withstand global and national food supply disruptions, supply chain disruptions. And then the public health, the final public health one was about develop community resilience hubs. There's a longer piece to that. That got a couple mentions and some questions about that. Okay, so those are the ones that popped up as priorities for you all to have a conversation. My suggestion for today, we don't have a lot of time right now. We've got about a half hour. I think we could take, this is a big, difficult conversation. The buildings and thermal piece, the market-based, the mechanism that's being suggested, the cap and invest piece. I think let's spend a half hour or so having a conversation about this, but only not to sort of solve this, but just be clear, like, are we clear among ourselves as a council? What are the things we're going to need to solve for? Or what are the concerns we're trying to wrestle with? And what's the information that's going to help us do this? We know that with the cap and invest, there's a study underway. We're going to have the results of that study in February. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. I just think it's important that we spend, say, a half hour teasing that out. I have some of the comments that you all provided. And before I show those, I just want to go back and show what the actual recommendations were. So I'll click into that in just a moment. For a second discussion block, which we'll do later in the meeting, I suggest we pick up some of those Ag and Eco ones, the greenhouse gas emissions accounting piece, the state education funding piece, the biomass piece. Again, not trying to solve these, but just sort of like lay out there, hey, these are the sort of range of concerns that we may have, and this is how we think we could have a good conversation about it over our next few meetings. Okay. That's what I'm suggesting. To get into it, my thought was I was just going to pull up what Buildings and Thermal suggested, just so we have a quick reminder. It's from the meeting last time. Let me just pull up that set of recommendations. Just give me 1 second. And as I'm doing that, think about how you would want to succinctly describe the concerns you have about these set of recommendations and the kinds of conversations you'd want to have on them. Here we go. So I'll just show as it was presented to you all. In the transportation one, this is the first transportation recommendation. Adopt a cap and invest policy to reduce emissions, including but not limited to transportation. Okay, so that's one of the ones that got several mentions of, hey, let's have a conversation about this. The other thing, I'm just going to scooch forward to the ones on thermal. This is one of the ones that got a number of mentions, right? Adopt a broad sector-wide mechanism to flexibly reduce thermal sector emissions through a range of end-use actions across buildings, fuels, and equipment. And there's the two options here that the subcommittee put forward: a modified clean heat standard, or through legislation, administrative action, join a cap and invest program, etc. And this is why it could tie into the conversation around transportation. The other ones here that got multiple mentions, this one actually got a number of mentions, but specifically the clean fuel ones got a number of mentions. This is the clean fuel one: adopt a performance-based clean fuel standard that implements a declining carbon intensity score requirement for residential, commercial, industrial fuels. Okay, so that's what the subcommittee put forward. The kinds of comments that came in, let me see if I can artfully do this. Look like this. I'll just let you read the screen here for a second so I can stop talking. Ina Smith, you might want to mute your microphone. Okay. All right, so this is the kinds of things that you all wrote in, and I bet you verbally may want to share more things. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can look at each other. And again, my goal over the next 25 minutes or so, 25 minutes, is just to say, what's going to help us have this conversation? What could we say to each other now to help each other understand what's really important on these issues? So that we set ourselves up for some problem solving. And I will fully recognize that this is a very tricky thing because the state legislature is working through similar issues simultaneously. And so I'll just put that out there as a tricky nature of the way you all as a council need to work right now. But for folks, particularly folks who express concern about this, are there things you'd want to say to each other now in ways you could imagine having this conversation that would be particularly constructive? I'll just open it up. Jared?
Thanks, David. I was just going to offer that one thing that I think will be really helpful when it comes to discussing questions around a possible cap and invest policy recommendation is having the context of the study and research that has been done and what's happening in other states, what the options are, what the pros and cons and key considerations are. And I would just offer to folks who have questions and concerns around costs and affordability. One of the things that is being studied right now that I think is really important is the opportunity to ensure that a cap and invest program would be progressive in terms of who is paying and who is benefiting. And the way that works, and that I think is worth a lot of attention by the council and others, is that you can dedicate a portion of the revenue received to be direct rebates to folks based on income, so that you hold low and middle income folks harmless, and that the folks who are paying for the incentives to help achieve the emissions reduction progress, especially the incentives for lower and middle income folks, are upper income folks. And we've seen this in other jurisdictions. In Canada, they have a cap and dividend program where their citizens are getting a dividend back. And so I just think that that's a really important policy piece to keep it for us to be aware of, and then to dive more deeply. And once this report comes back, to the extent that there are questions around costs and affordability, is the ability to provide rebates to folks based on their income. I think that will be really important to that conversation, to the extent that that is a question and concern of folks. Certainly is of mine, and that's why that policy is appealing to me.
Thanks, Jared. Julie?
I think maybe before we dive into the sort of details Jared's describing, we probably need to sort of have a discussion about the level of detail contained in the recommendations that the Climate Council is going to advance. I think, David, you flagged some very real challenges around timing, and that there's work in process right now around cap and invest. There's sort of an unknown of what the legislature will choose to do with that. There's also a set of unknowns around the legislature's engagement on the clean heat standard. There's another recommendation that the PUC, I understand, will put forward around a thermal energy benefit charge. And I think, having a shared sense of what the role of the council is, The council currently has significant authority to direct the agency to undertake rulemaking, and the timing of that direction has the potential to be enormously problematic with what the legislature may be contemplating. And I think, you know, open-ended recommendations that take into account sort of the current status of those different bodies of work, including the discussions that will take place in the legislature this year, are very different than some of the more specific language that was in the draft recommendations that were shared out with the council.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate you putting that on the table. And I think it's worth a conversation now-ish about how to strike that balance in the context of the different moving pieces that you'll be dealing with. Michelle?
I just wanted to echo the secretary's points. I think until we have the final report on Cap and Invest delivered, and until the work of the PUC is completed and additional engagement with the legislature, I think it's premature for the council to strike off in a direction that may or may not be legislatively supported. I think there is a way, I think, to capture the ongoing attention to these particular items by the council, and continued need for follow-up as it relates to when an approach or approaches will be ripe for advancing. But I don't know that it's behooves the Climate Council to get ahead of some of these other proceedings that are going to be occurring over the next several months.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think to that point, Michelle, it's tricky, right? Because the council has a deadline too, right? And the council needs to, you know, if you all want to get out a draft version of your updated climate action plan in late March, and a final one needs to be submitted by July 1st. So it's a very tricky thing about how you sequence that. Okay. Do other folks have reflections about this, Chris?
David, I apologize. I had to, biology necessitated that I step away for a moment. So are we talking, for this discussion block, are we talking just the thermal and greenhouse gas emissions, or are we talking?
This block right now, we're talking about the building thermal recommendations of a sort of sector-wide thing. Like as they put in their recommendation, they call it a modified clean heat standard or some other mechanism like Cap and Invest. And also that's related to the transportation one around Cap and Invest. Those are the ones that we're talking about in this block right now. Other reflections about how to have these conversations, Rich?
I'm going to echo your point that this is a difficult conversation to have because of the timing challenge. But I would just observe that the Climate Council was created to create a climate plan that would, in some respects, be advisory to the legislature. And, you know, I think we tie ourselves in knots if we say, well, we have to wait for the legislature to decide what it's going to do before we do our job of advising them what we judge would be the best to do. So as we did last time, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the council to suggest that we think the best approach to achieving the goals of the GWSA consists of the following priority actions. And that's our job. And it's true that legislative action may very well be required, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. But that doesn't mean that we have to wait until the legislature acts in order for us to make a recommendation for action.
Thanks, Rich. Julie?
Yeah, I think some of this is going to come down to how the recommendations are phrased. I guess I'd push back a little bit, Rich. The legislature has given the Climate Council the ability to require the agency to act, and it could be requiring the agency to act in a manner that's inconsistent with the legislative conversation. And so as long as we're committed to phrasing recommendations in a way where they really are providing advice and not explicit legally binding direction, I think that that's fine. But I don't want to sort of gloss over the fact that there is a lot of legal authority that vests with the Climate Council. And I worry about being put in the position of having two different authorities driving the work of this agency.
Thanks, Julie. That's really helpful.
So, and my response is sort of in two parts. I appreciate that concern, and I have appreciated the conversations that we've had over the years about it. So far, I think we've managed the relationship quite well, and I hope we can continue to do that.
Thanks, Rich. Okay. Are there other things to say about this, Joey?
Well, I'm just on this topic. Thanks, David. And I appreciate the timing challenge and what the secretary is raising, and also appreciate what Rich has raised. So the dynamics are, a little in tension in some ways. But I guess one of the questions I have is the process piece of it. I want to underscore second what Jared had recommended of the need to do a little bit of edification about what a cap and invest program is. Appreciate Jane dropped in some links, but it feels like we need some presentations and expertise, like from Washington State, who just reaffirmed their commitment to their cap and invest program after a referendum. New York is doing good work. I just think it would be helpful to all of us to just get a grounding, because I do not see Vermont moving forward alone. I think it would be in a participatory way, whether through a regional partnership like Western Climate Initiative or New York. So I think we just need more information, and I would love to work on, getting some people who could present to us and give us a sense of what this is, what it's done, what its benefits, challenges, costs, et cetera. Because I think we are trying to manage a lot. And then I guess, David, I have a question for you. You raised February 10th as focusing on a cap and invest, and that's 5 days before the final study is due. So I'm just a little bit concerned that timing might be off. I mean, we don't have the final report, because the words on the page are pretty succinct and clear in terms of the recommendation, but we have also been clear as a task group and a subcommittee that we need to look at the results of the analysis due by February 15th before we can make a final recommendation. So I'm just curious if you can speak to the process of the February 10th date in particular, unless I misheard you.
Yeah, no, you did not mishear me at all. I see Jane hopefully has her hand up to help explain a little bit on the timing issue there. And I will say in the steering committee meeting last week, Jared brought up the concern that the folks in the science and data and cross-sector subcommittees would like to be able to weigh in on this. And so whatever we do, we need to create a space, whether at that February 10th meeting or elsewhere earlier, for those subcommittees with that expertise to weigh in. Jane?
Yeah, I guess 2 points then. First, the idea of February 10th was actually intentional to be ahead of the treasurer's recommendation. And so maybe just to back up to make sure everybody, including new members of the Climate Council, understand what's sort of happening right now is A&R with VTrans was required through the transportation bill last year, which built upon your recommendations in the transportation addendum to the cap, to complete a study of Vermont participating in both WCI and what we expect to be the impending New York cap and invest program. That technical study is drafted and was due to V-Trans and A&R at the end of the year. And that technical report is currently being finalized by February 1st, so the end of this month. And then so at the end of the year, as that technical draft came forward, there was a handoff to the treasurer's office, who's been a partner along the way in being kept up to speed on the technical analysis, but is the one required by the legislature through the transportation bill to make a recommendation to the legislature about joining a potential program, not joining a potential program, what that would look like for Vermont, whatever their recommendation may end up being. So and then this will sort of speak to Jared's comments, which I apologize, I had to leave the steering committee meeting early last week. But we had made this intentional discussion and decision that because we're at where we are in the climate action plan drafting and recommendations, and the hierarchy sort of nature of the council being the ultimate deciders of what that looks like, not the subcommittees, that it takes a lot of effort to sort of bring people up to speed on that technical analysis, and that we would skip over the subcommittees, of course, them being welcome to attend on the February 10th, but really do our homework with bringing the council up to speed on what's in that technical study and what the sort of technical components of a cap and invest are. And so that's the intent of February 10th, not to sort of dive into the recommendation, but really to have the council understand the policy and what's at play for a recommendation. And that's our hope. And then my understanding, just since I'm talking about Jared's comments with the subcommittee's presentations, which I fully support, is that any review discussion of assumptions around the business as usual updates, that needs to go to the subcommittees to have them that discussed before that is finalized as a technical analysis, which is still coming. And that is our intent with that study.
Thanks, Jane. Helpful. Joey?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jane. That's super helpful. One just question though, just were you saying in terms of recommendation to, I get the technical analysis and hearing from the consultants, that seems really important, very helpful. I would hope that the full council would potentially also to contextualize this, hear from like Washington State, New York State, is that, or were you just saying that that would happen at the subcommittee level only? Just trying to clarify.
No, we have not, Joey, and you all should, as a council, should talk about this. We've talked about our role is just bringing in our technical consultant. So they would obviously reference the work they did in the outreach with Washington, California, and New York as part of that study, but we've not intended to bring in representatives from other states. So that's something you all as a council should talk about and where and how that would fit in if it's something you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
because I'm more than happy to help facilitate that, Joey, if that's important for the council. And you all feel like, you know what, in addition to the technical consultants there, let's have somebody, like you say, who's living it.
Yes, I would love to see us do that. And I'd love to work with you or whomever, but it seems to contextualize like where it's actually in play and like Washington State, where it's being considered and our neighbors in New York and what we should be considering and like the implications of its implementation in Washington. And so anyway, I would love to see that happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. Other reflections or thoughts about how to have this conversation as a council? Okay. Okay, great. I think this was really helpful and sort of priming up some of the core dilemmas and tensions. My suggestion, folks, is we actually take a break. We were going to take a break nowish anyway. If we were to do that a little early, we might buy ourselves a little time later. So if folks are okay, let's take a 12, 13-minute break. We'll be back at 12:20, if that's all right with folks. And we'll start the legislative report conversation there. So back at 12:20, which is a little bit before what the agenda says online, which says 12:25, but let's be back at 12:20. And we can do the report to the legislature conversation then. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you back here at 12:20. All right. So I encourage folks, counselors, if you want to get your cameras back on, that just lets us know you're here. Thanks, Jared, for the chat. Okay. All right. So Jane's going to walk us through this, and we actually wanted to leave a little bit of reading time for folks. So Jane, do you want to say a few things about this report and then have folks sit for 5 minutes and read it?
Thank you. So yes, let me, I will start. Annually, the Climate Action Office over the last few years has prepared the Climate Council's legislative report on your behalf. This is due annually on January 15th and is supposed to represent a progress report, so to speak, of what the Climate Council has been up to over the last year. We've taken a very similar approach annually about reporting on first some background on the GWSA and the roles of the Climate Council, speaking specifically to laws that have been put in place by the legislature the previous year that have ties to the Climate Action Plan, and then talking to specific technical analysis or projects underway with ties to the GWSA. We did the same approach this year and wanted to update you on 2 new sections of the report that have not been there in recent years. So first is a status report on emissions reductions. So I imagine many of you know that January 1st, 2025 was the first statutory deadline for our emissions reductions in the GWSA. We are, as a state, required to have cut our emissions 26% below 2005 levels. As you all also know, that statutory sort of backstop to that is the greenhouse gas inventory for the year 2024. That won't actually be produced for another 2 to 2.5 years. And I think you all know that the greenhouse gas inventory lags a number of years, largely because of national data sets that we rely on from EPA for certain sectors. That said, we'll also have some really good data from Vermont specific fuel sales by March, the end of February, for both the thermal sector and the transportation sector. And so we'll have a good understanding of roughly where we are with meeting that target then. So we added a section in the report that speaks to all of that in layman's terms, shows an update on the latest greenhouse gas inventory and signals an update to the BAU, the business as usual model that we're currently producing. That's a new section. And then we also added a section towards the end that not only focuses on next steps for the Climate Council, but also some challenges around council member appointments, capacity issues, and the overall scope of the work and task. And so wanted to draw your attention to both of those as you're reviewing the report. And like David alluded to, we added some extra time on the agenda for this section, knowing that we weren't as timely as we needed to be in getting this up on the website for you all to review thoughtfully before today. And because we'd actually like to work with you to approve a set of notes, but also approve the report based on those notes today so that we can be on time submitting it, wanted to give you some ample time to review it right now. So I'll pause there and then be ready to answer any questions that you have after maybe, David, 5 to 10 minutes for folks to just review it.
Yeah, I would say 10 because it's a fairly lengthy document. Well, it's a lot of bullet points. If you don't have it handy, let me throw it again in the chat. To click on it right there. It's 12:25. Let's take 10 minutes. I'll check in at 8 and see if anybody still needs 2 more, but let's take up to 10 minutes and just read through, maybe jump to the section you're most interested in. And if you have questions, drop them in the chat and we'll try to deal with them there. Thanks, everyone. This is official reading time. Just checking if anybody wants another 2 minutes. Happy to provide them. Just want to check and make sure that's really needed. No? It's okay if you do, just checking. Okay. I'm not actually seeing requests for additional time. So what I'd love to do then is start the conversation with all of you about how you all could approve this document today. And as Jane and I have mentioned, we think the pathway for that is to agree on a set of notes if there are things you would like to see edited in this document. So my request then is if you think about anything that's standing in the way of you approving this document, let's get that out there and see if we can agree as a council on that set of notes. And then Jane can make those changes and submit it on your behalf. Chris, thanks for the recommendation in the chat. I'll have everyone just take a look at that real quick. Under next steps, suggest adding council engagement with frontline communities to understand the impacts of the flood, snow, and wind disasters since the climate action plan was adopted, and to understand if the municipal vulnerability index adequately achieves its intent. And similarly, if the resilience implementation strategy will meet needs. So thanks, Chris. Would anybody have a concern about adding that into the report, or maybe a friendly amendment to that? Because we want to all sign up for these notes, because these are the shared notes you're going to have. So let me just check. Any friendly amendments to Chris's suggestions, or any pushback, or people who have a different view than that? Okay.
David?
Yeah, Joey.
I guess in terms of Chris's friendly suggestion, I take it as a friendly recommendation, and I just wonder about adding understand the impacts, and I would add the costs of those disasters.
Great. Thanks, Joey.
Yep.
Carrick?
Mine's more of a question. I'm just, and we don't have to belabor it too much, but I'm just concerned, what's a frontline community?
It's a great question. Yep. And Chris, maybe you want to take a stab at what you were intending with that phrase?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact language in all of the just transitions language. But we talked, I know that, and again, I was away for a couple of years, but we talked about frontline communities being those most directly impacted by climate change, both the worsening climate, just more challenging climate conditions, as well as the fixes to it. And so my reference to frontline communities are those people, those communities that have been most directly impacted by the disasters that have transpired in the years since the plan was first adopted. The other thing, just while I've got the floor, I'm fine with adding the costs, Johanna, and I'd also frankly like to add ongoing displacement of people from their homes.
Okay.
David, if I may, sorry, I just
Please
wanted to
jump
follow
right
to
in,
Chris.
Carrick. Yep.
I hear you, but it's kind of a recapitulation of the point a little bit. So do you have, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is, all right, well, communities that live along rivers, right? And if that's the only, because there's different kinds of manifestations of what's going on in different communities. I just haven't, at least in my own mind, Chris, I could see those along the, in a valley, along a river that have been hit with floods time and time again. That makes sense to me. But beyond that, it's endemic, right? It's pervasive. I'm not sure. That's all. But you've responded, I've responded and responded. So I got you.
Could I make a suggestion that we can, and I can show my screen in just a second. I'm taking some notes. I cut and pasted Chris's comment from the chat, and I've just edited a little bit based on these inputs, which is, council engagement with communities most directly impacted by recent climate disasters to understand the impacts, including persistent displacement and the cost of the flood, snow, and wind disasters, blah, blah, blah. Right. So just sort of say a little bit more what we mean, if that sounds okay. I can show my screen in a sec with that.
I'm good.
Thank you. I see in the chat, Jared, you dropped something else. Let me just check. At the end of the status of greenhouse gas section. Jared, can you suggest what that is?
Yeah, just for context, I think some folks may be aware that there has been disagreement in terms of the status of where we stand as a state in relation to the greenhouse gas reduction obligation for 2025, the first requirement in the Solutions Act. And I don't think that we need to get back into that now or necessarily include those disagreements in this report. But when I reflect on what the legislature is asking us for, it says an assessment of in this report, including progress towards meeting the greenhouse gas reduction requirements in the act. I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who would be reading this and wondering, okay, what is the status? How much progress are we making or not towards meeting the greenhouse gas reduction requirements in the act? It does strike me that it could be beneficial to add a sentence at the end of that section that at least summarizes something that I believe we all agree on and that all modeling has shown, and that would be this sentence, just in the interest of clarity and summarizing where things stand. So my suggestion would be to add that sentence at the end of the status of greenhouse gas emissions section.
Okay. Folks can see that in the chat, what Jared is suggesting. Other views on that? Folks comfortable with that? Any questions about that? Does that work for everybody? Okay.
David?
Yeah.
I understand that it's important that we detail additional policy and regulatory actions. How about detailing citizen actions?
Okay. How is that, just clearly, just so I understand, how is that different than policies and regulatory action that citizen? Oh, I see. Okay. Jared, just making sure that that also fits with what you're trying to express there.
I mean, that's not language that, I mean, I think that policy and regulatory action is best designed to help support individual action. I'm not comfortable pointing to people who don't have the resources to take action without the type of incentives and support that would come from policy and regulation. So I see the gap as primarily a policy and regulatory gap rather than kind of putting this on the individual. So I hear David's point. I personally would prefer to leave the language as suggested if others are okay with that.
Okay. Thanks. David, do you hear that Jared's concern with adding that? It kind of is a little bit of apples and oranges in that.
Yeah, no, we agree to disagree.
Okay. All right. Any other views on Jared's piece, suggested piece? Okay. Anything else? Rich?
Yeah, I have a question and perhaps a concern about the pie chart, which appears to show that 2/3 of a substantial amount of money that has been spent on climate action has been spent or dedicated to mitigation as opposed to adaptation and resilience. And the reason I'll state it as a question. I went and looked at a report also created, I think, by the Climate Office, detailing all of the expenditures. There's a very substantial amount of expenditures in a whole bunch of different programs. And for some of them, and particularly for some of the big numbers in agriculture, for example, the text would say this grant is going to be dedicated to reducing runoff for water quality protection from farms, which is an important and big program. And then the word climate is also kind of mentioned in there. And I don't have any way of knowing whether because climate was mentioned in that grant, those expenditures ended up being labeled as mitigation. And whereas, the vast majority of the money is most likely not climate mitigation, it's most likely water quality improvement. And so I just wondered whether the conclusion that's next to that pie chart, that 2/3 of the money has been spent on mitigation, is actually accurate, or whether it would be better to say something along the lines of, mitigation or projects that include mitigation as part of its purpose.
Okay. Before I jump to Jared, someone who, or maybe Jared, you have this, but whoever's involved in putting together that pie chart and can explain what it does and doesn't do, and whether Rich's concern can be addressed through what he says, or would there be better to do some other way?
Yeah. So I'd be happy to discuss and how to nuance the terminology in that report. Let me start by saying the intent is that section of the report and the council report is intended to show progress associated with legislative action. And we also know, obviously, over the last several years, there's been significant progress due to influxes of federal funding through ARPA, through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and now IRA and other state-directed funding sources. So we wanted to do our best to add a section that shows new funding for climate action into the report to show progress that could be realized through that funding. Last year was the first year of the Climate Office with the support of our Interagency Advisory Board to the CAO. So that's represented by many of the agencies who sit on the Climate Council. Their secretaries or commissioners delegate directors and others to sit on that board. We were able to pull together what is intended to show not all spending in state budget, but new funding that has a primary purpose of climate action. So it was supposed to be not like a co-benefit of the funding, but either directed at the funds are directly attempting to meet a climate outcome, or that is intended in the funds. So we pulled that together last year. This year, we're in the current budget of fiscal year 25, and we're trying to clean up, do a better job of reflecting that funding. In that paragraph, you'll note we were trying to also be clear that the number is sort of inflated because it shows all of Solar for All or all of the HERA programs in the Public Service Department's budget, even though we know they're not going to spend that all in fiscal year 25, and that's sort of an overinflated number as a result. But so we tried to caveat that. But as state staff filled out the spreadsheet, they noted mitigation, resilience as primary benefits, and then we broke it out in a pie chart that way. Happy to nuance it further if folks are uncomfortable with it, or any kind of clarity you want to do. But we're trying to support showing we're in the budget, there's new sources of funding, and also obviously trying to also show that these funding sources in many parts are temporal, like they're federal funds that have end dates that if we don't figure out how to backfill, they will go away.
Thanks, Jane. So folks, I really want to try to finish up here at 12:50. So I don't want to get too deep into this, but to address Rich's point, is there any kind of update that would need to happen? Jared, quickly on this.
Yeah, just one clarifying question and one suggestion. The clarifying question would be for the disaster funding that's related to flood response, is that being included in the definition of resilience and adaptation is the question. And the suggestion would just be on that kind of donut or bagel chart, depending on your breakfast sphere of choice. I think it would be helpful to put the dollar amounts so that those can be seen, and then maybe a source or citation below that gives those definitions so that there can be a little bit more clarity about what's included in each.
Thanks, Jared. Joey?
And just a similar point, because I appreciate what Jane's saying, but also appreciate the importance of just being clear. I wonder if there could be like a summary, because like the Inflation Reduction Act came with a very specific set of goals, which is largely climate pollution reduction measures and clean job deployment. ARPA, same thing, bipartisan infrastructure and jobs act. It may be helpful to just denote what some of those core programs goals were intended to do, sort of building on what Jared was saying as well. Just a thought.
Okay. So in summary on this, it sounds like A, it's helpful to cite this information, B, helpful to maybe put dollar amounts, and C, maybe reference some of these programs and why there may be this larger share going to the mitigation. Rich, would that solve the issue?
Well, no, I think that what the additional sentence should say, you know, many of these funds serve multiple purposes. You know.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
fine. I think Rich's comment makes a lot of sense, and we can add that. But maybe I would just offer a point, Rich, and just say that is the case in certain instances, but the intent of the summary is to provide dollars that have a primary purpose or co-purpose of mitigation, resilience, adaptation.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay. And then I'll just say, happy to add the total amounts to the pie chart, donut chart. And then just want to note that I think capacity wise, like, I don't think we'll be able to add summaries of all the grant funding sources to this, but so I just want to note that my intent would not be to do that. And then there is a link to the Excel spreadsheet that shows all those different funding sources, and maybe we could link in there like to an IRA page or a bipartisan infrastructure page or something, but Liz and I can talk about that, but likely there won't be summaries included of all the funding sources at this juncture.
Okay. Thanks, folks. So what I have in terms of notes here is a modified version of what Chris put in the chat, what Jared put in the chat and the way he put it in. And then this last question on an issue on the pie chart and the description of those funds, put the dollar amount citation, denote the purposes. So that's going to be hard to do, but maybe make some links and then add a sentence, just one. Many of the funds serve multiple purposes. Okay. Anything else folks would want to do to feel comfortable signing off on this report? Okay. Thank you. Oh, Carrick, did you want to jump in? Sorry.
I just have to say, I am not completely conversant. You know, I'm catching up. This is day 6. I had to testify Friday. So when you say, David, you're doing exactly what you should be doing. So in that spirit, I want to say, I'm going with this, but, and I think people know I'll be direct if I have some stuff, but I still have work to do. So if that's that is what it is.
Fair. And I think that could be reflected in our notes from this meeting, right? That some counselors felt like they're getting up to speed. And so while they are saying, okay, I don't have concerns, it's honestly, they're in a period of getting up to speed.
I would be grateful for that.
Yeah, we can absolutely add that into our notes. Okay, folks, not hearing concerns. I'm going to say,
David, I see a hand from Dahlia.
Oh, Dahlia.
Yeah, sorry, I still have not figured out how to raise a hand on the Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm curious if there's any worth in putting in a sentence or two. Just, I'm the youth rep. I feel like it's worth throwing it out there about youth engagement and our youth subcommittee reps. I don't know. I feel like that would need to be long, but just some word to that. If this is the right place to integrate that, great. And maybe it's not the right place. But just throwing that out there.
That seems entirely reasonable. Anybody have a concern about that? Okay. Thanks, Talia. Any last things? And sorry if I'm not catching hands, just open your mic up. Okay. Thank you all. Great. So with that, why don't we go to public comment? And as our typical practice here is, raise your hand in the Zoom. It should be down on the bottom of your screen, right in the middle of the sort of options and things down there. Again, if it's not, drop something in the chat or just we're not that many folks right now. So if you want to just come off camera, or if you've been a member of the public or someone joining us today, feel free to raise your hand or come off camera. Otherwise, let me know you'd like to make a comment. We'll take up to 20 minutes today of public comment because that's what we said we'd do. If we need to do that, we will, or whatever we have in terms of people's participation today. So I'll just sit here for a second and see if anybody wants to come off camera or raise their hand, participate in today's public comment, and provide some input to the council. Also, if you would want to put something in the chat, now is the time. If members of the public want to put something in the chat, if you're more comfortable doing that, feel free. Steve Crawley, go ahead. And like I said, we're trying to stick to about 2 minutes, so I'll let you know when that's up. Thanks, Steve.
Well, greetings, everybody. Happy New Year. Thanks for all the great work you're doing on this huge task. I just want to take an opportunity to point to what's going on in California right now, what went on in North Carolina and other parts of the Appalachians a few months ago. This is nuts. Right now, you know, the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act are based on the Paris agreements. And the Paris Agreement calls for 1.5 to not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. We're there. You know, that's not possible to meet that goal anymore. We're probably past that goal. But that's, you know, the significance of that is that's kind of recognized as a starting point for where we're entering this area where dangerous climate feedbacks start to happen. And we're starting to see that stuff. The evidence is coming through in the science that we are starting to see those dangerous climate feedbacks relating to sea level rise, storms, changes to currents in the ocean and all that stuff. And the impact of that is what we are just starting to see. So the fires in California right now, that's just the tip of the iceberg, if I could use a bad metaphor. And so I don't know how to look at this. People have never really wanted to look at this. But the fact is that it's a lot worse than anybody predicted it was going to be, and it's happening faster. So, you know, when people start talking about rolling back the deadlines and things, I think that's insane. That's morally reprehensible. I can't imagine being in a position of explaining that to my grandchildren in 20, 30 years. Well, why didn't, and people will say in 10 or 20 years, well, gee, if only we'd done something 10 or 20 years ago. And what we talk about now is rolling back what's going on. And that's the worst possible thing. So I guess I could go on with this, but I think you all understand where I'm coming from, that this is it's no time to be lighting up or finding excuses or finding inconveniences about what we have to do in front of us right now. We owe this to our children and grandchildren to do the right thing instead of futzing around and having to explain why we didn't do it in 10 years. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for commenting. Appreciate that. Anybody else who's joining our meeting today have a comment they'd like to make? Matthew?
Yes, this is Matthew LaFleur. I actually have a comment for Jojo Miller, because that does involve a partnership, since the last climate partnership we tried to have with Massachusetts failed. I'm wondering if there's a timeline on making this second attempt, with our partners, regional partnerships across, like I said, the Western or the New York, branch, if that's gonna and that's just a question, if that's gonna be this time it's gonna succeed in that, moving forward with that capital and invest, since it failed the last time with Massachusetts, pulling the plug. Is there any chance, us as climate council members succeeding this time around? Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew, for the comment. Thank you very much. Any other folks who've joining us today? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, folks, for joining. Thanks for the comments. Okay. So next up, while I'm pulling up the agenda, if any counselors want to chime in as reflecting what you just heard, feel free. It's going to take me a second to get back to our next block of conversation. So feel free to just raise a hand and if folks want to chime in what you just heard. Okay. Or Joey, yeah.
I mean, if we're taking time, I just will appreciate Steve's bringing us back to sort of the why of the work. People may or may not be aware, this is the 20th anniversary of Vermont enshrining its greenhouse gas emission goals and statutes. So we've been pointing in this, in this direction for 20 years, and we still have more work to do, which is, and to Matthew's point, which I also appreciate, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good one. And I think it speaks to what we were talking about in terms of needing to to edify ourselves as we prepare to make a potential recommendation on cap and invest to avoid the decade plus of work that we spent with partners regionally on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, and to look at what is a viable solution that will serve multiple goals, including pollution reduction. So appreciating both of the comments. Thanks for it.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah. Okay. So what we want to do over the next block of time is do a little repeat of how we dove into the cap and invest stuff and the buildings and thermal stuff, and talk a little bit about the concerns we have on some of these other priority recommendations or priority actions, excuse me. I will bring them up on screen in just a second. Just as a reminder, when I showed it earlier, these were, where'd it go? Hang on just a second. My screen share decided to do a little glitch right there. I showed this earlier as our second block of conversation. There were three in particular that jumped out. One was the greenhouse gas emissions accounting and how to think about net accounting for ag. There was a report that was done on that. There was a recommendation around redesigning the state education funding. And then there was a recommendation coming out on biomass that included kind of different versions of how people felt in the subcommittee about it. And so again, can we talk about the concerns, start to get those on the table, and then think about how we can have great conversations about these going forward. And let's see how far we get. We have, let's look at our agenda just for a second together. In this second block of priority, we have until 1:45. So we got about 45 minutes till we have to talk about our writing assignments. Okay, so let me just share some of that content that I just mentioned and from the presentation that was given to you on during your last meeting. This is from the Ag and Ecosystem recommendations, and one of the ones coming out of the Ag and Ecosystem subcommittee was this update, the greenhouse gas inventory to account both carbon sequestration and emission reduction benefits from agriculture. You'll notice in the report that you just were commenting on and approving. There was a technical report on this, and folks from Ag and Eco can speak a little bit more to that. And Ryan Patch is here as well, can speak more to it. I can show you some comments that came in about these in just a second. The other one that generated some comment was about changing the way education systems are funded. Let me see if I can find that. If you give me just 1 second. In the meantime, here's the biomass one. So there was some confusion expressed about what was going on here. The subcommittee was not fully unanimous on the way to do this, but wanted to reflect as far as they got, which is most members of that subcommittee felt represented by this priority action recommendation, which is to fund and undertake as soon as possible the study that you all as a council suggested should happen in that biomass update you did about 12 months ago. And in the meantime, this is coming out of the subcommittee, enact a moratorium on approvals of new biomass utility scale electric energy facilities. So that's what came out of most members of the subcommittee felt represented by that in their final meeting when they discussed this. Other subcommittee members had different views. And so it was important to capture those different views. One of those different views was to be much more aggressive in the sort of concern around biomass and state something aggressive like that. Shall eliminate biomass as a utility scale energy source, stop referring to it as renewable energy. And others on the subcommittee felt more represented by this statement, which was more fund the study, the same study we're talking about here. And in that document, the addendum that you all as a council approved, there's guidance to the Public Utilities Commission about what to do in the meantime and the things to look at in the meantime. And so folks were saying, just keep using that guidance while the study's not here. Okay, so that's the biomass one. And it'll take me just a second to find the other thing. But in the meantime, let me share some comments that I got on those two, which I have in my other deck, if you give me just a moment. So in the biomass, here's some comments if folks want to just take a moment and read. All right. And then the comments on the other pieces on the left-hand side, these are two comments about the education one, and I will dig that up, I promise, and show you the exact language. And so here's two comments on the left-hand side about that, and here's two comments on the right-hand side about the accounting issue for net and gross for agriculture. So if you want to just take a moment and read these. Again, these are comments from you all, counselors. Okay. So my suggestion is we actually start with the emissions piece here and talk a little bit about sort of what's going on and what kind of conversation you want to have about that. Then let's go over to this thing. I'll find the language for us to look at. And then finally, we'll do biomass at the end. So in terms of the folks who made some comments around wanting to have a conversation about the net and gross emissions piece on ag, could folks help just frame up the conversation you want to have and the concerns or other ideas you want to have on the table about that? And also, if you do have questions about that study, probably Ryan Patch is the one most able to answer those questions. Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, and my apologies. I don't think I wrote in the comments my questions or concerns about that recommendation because I am still not fully clear on what the recommendation is. So I wanted to start in the form of a question and then I'll share a concern. I think the question for me is, what is the intent of the recommendation? Is it to have information available so that folks can understand an estimate of the amount of the carbon or GHGs that are sequestered in ag soils as, you know, information that is in and is supplemental to the inventory? Or is it a recommendation to change the inventory accounting process away from a gross emissions inventory and towards a net emissions inventory? I would be comfortable with the first part of that in terms of adding information in, supplemental information. I am not comfortable with a recommendation about moving from a gross emissions inventory to a net emissions inventory for 3 reasons, and I want to share those concerns. One is just my view as a counselor and of our role as a council is that our responsibility is to make recommendations to the legislature and to the administration about how to comply with the law as it is written, not how to change the law so that compliance can be measured in a way that contradicts the legislature's intent. And the law is clearly written as that the GWSA emissions reduction requirements are to be measured on a gross basis. The second is in terms of consistency and alignment with other states. There is no state that neighbors us that uses this approach. Gross emissions accounting is utilized by Maine, by Connecticut, by Massachusetts, by New York, by Washington, by Oregon, by California. And I think one of the reasons for that, at least my third concern, is that the methodologies for doing gross emissions accounting are much more developed and I think have a greater degree of accuracy and confidence than some of the still very evolving and less confident ways of measuring sequestration and storage on the ag and forest side. I think it's an important question. I think we need to keep researching it. But if the idea is that we would suggest something that contradicts and contravenes how the law is written, I don't think that's our role, and I don't think it's appropriate.
Thanks, Jared. Okay. David?
Yeah, just to add to this, and I'll start by echoing Carrick and saying I'm still, of course, trying to catch up to an avalanche of information. But I did have some part of the conversation a couple of 3 years ago when I was on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And I came away with the sense that the goal was kind of more like what Jared was describing in terms of the first option, that there should be a more robust analysis of the sequestration benefits of agriculture, not just agriculture, frankly, but forestry and forest management and our forests. So that would be my friendly amendment to this. It'd be, I'm not sure. I don't know what the current subcommittee intended. Ryan can speak to that, but I do think that the way that Jared framed it makes the most sense to me, and I just want to add forests into the mix as we think about the important, one of the most critical for carbon sinks in the state.
Thanks, David. Others, and Ryan, feel free to jump in, or others who have been as close as possible to that technical report that was done, and may also speak to some of Jared's questions about sort of what the precedent is out there for this. Other thoughts? Ryan?
So what if the law is wrong? What if the law that was passed is incongruent with how agriculture as a sector is supposed to be quantified according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Do we proceed with the emissions inventory as it's been conducted, or do you do the research and come away with some recommendations to help quantify the agricultural sector as accurately as possible? I have all the answers you want. They're all laid out. They're all cited. It's very straightforward. But as always, there's probably not enough time to get into that. So I would like to just share one slide, which has 4 sentences on it, which answers, Jared, I heard 2 questions from you, but the 3 points, I suppose, and then provide a bit more context. So I hopefully have the ability to share my screen.
Yeah, you're good to go.
We shall see how this goes. Great, thanks. So here's the background, right? Last time Climate Council convened, the recommendation was do the research. ANR retained ICF. ICF is the contractor that develops, maintains, and administers the U.S. inventory of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and sinks, and they put out the state level breakdown. These are the people that do the inventory. These people do the SIT tool that is the basis for the state's greenhouse gas emission inventory. That was who was retained to do this research. Their summary remarks include: one, it makes sense to keep using the state inventory tool for the state of Vermont's greenhouse gas emission inventory. They then recommend to report a complete agricultural greenhouse gas inventory. ICF recommend that ANR report emissions and removals from agricultural lands as estimated by the SIT LULUCF module alongside greenhouse gas estimates from the SIT Ag module. Soil carbon flux is in a different module than has historically been used in the state of Vermont to report greenhouse gas emissions for agriculture. ICF says you got to report both. You should report both if you want to complete one. Don't have to. Currently not. Comet Planner is then recommended as a tool to use to account for implementation of management practices in combination with the SIT agricultural greenhouse gas emission module, as well as the LULUCF module. Their conclusion is to commend the state of Vermont as one of the leading US states in ICF's knowledge to be exploring means of customizing their ag, forestry, and other land use greenhouse gas inventory to support emissions and removals policy decisions. In ICF's knowledge, California and Hawaii have developed and maintained state-specific AFOLU greenhouse gas inventory. So there are 2 states out there that use ANET accounting for agriculture. California uses the DNDC model, which includes management practices. So to be congruent with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommendations, ICF gives us the outline that you take the existing ag emissions module, you add the LULUCF module, and then you add Comet Planner to account for all of those water quality conservation practices that have a climate mitigation co-benefit. And this is important. This is all important because let me stop sharing for just 1 second and just put up that there has been 92,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent net sequestered on agricultural operations since Act 64 of 2015. That's the same as 16,000 internal combustion engine fossil fuel passenger vehicles being removed from the road. There's significant work being done in the agricultural sector, and to ensure agriculture is accounted in conformance with the experts that lay out how ag greenhouse gas emission inventory should be conducted around the world, including the soils as part of agriculture's inventory is what's advised. So that's the brief summary. There's many, many more details that could be shared, and I'd be happy to share that at any time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. That was really helpful. I'm glad you shared that. And, I was just watching the chat as well, and I just want to tease out that, is there a difference between what you're suggesting, Ryan, and adjusting the inventory for purposes of knowing if Vermont makes its targets or not? Are they one and the same, you're thinking, or are you doing, there's actually different?
It has to be. Agriculture needs, if you're going to set emission reduction targets, which currently are, set to make reductions from the 1990 baseline. If this agricultural sector was to be updated to become, you know, AFOLU assessment, right, you'd have to look back to 1990. And so it's not going to change, like it's going to change all of the agricultural values, but it's not going to change it for other sectors. I really don't understand and would be happy to dig into, you know, the mechanics of how the inventory can be updated to ensure conformity with ICF's recommendations while ensuring the changes are only applied to the agricultural sector. You know, it's going to go back to 1990 and it's going to look forward.
Okay. Thanks. Kelly?
So I really appreciate what you just shared, Ryan, and also understand your concerns, Jared. I think there's a huge potential in agriculture to help us. Complying with the law is all great, but actually making the world better and having fewer greenhouse gases and doing the goal is to actually change how the climate is reverse climate change, right? That's our goal. And so the law is there to help us get there. But if we, I think if we put more emphasis on the power that agriculture has to help us get there, even if we, I mean, we should also still hit the gross emissions reductions on top of that. Let's do let's do better. But I think agriculture deserves a really I think it deserves more time and energy and more focus, and I'm really excited to hear that there's better accounting that does take into account specific agricultural practices and encouraging better practices that will help with sequestration and should also help with our future and our ability to continue to produce food for Vermonters going forward. So I'm very excited about that, and I think it's really important that we have that focus embedded in our plan going forward, even if it doesn't mean we need to change our gross emissions reduction goals in some way. But I also think Brian has some thoughts on how that doesn't. We're not moving the ball. We're not hiding the ball. What's the phrase? But we're like comparing apples and apples. As long as we're comparing apples and apples, I think that's another thing that we could potentially look at and saying, calculate it the same way in 1990, calculate it the same way in 2000, calculate it the same way in 2030 and 2050. But that's not my area of expertise.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate that. Excuse me, Ryan.
Jael had her hand up next.
Oh yeah, sorry, Joe.
It's okay. Yeah, I guess because a lot of the discussion that we're having in the Ag and Eco Subcommittee is about incentives and it's not just farmers, but foresters as well to do a better job. And, you know, it's basic biology. We need more biomass, and by biomass, I mean vegetation. We're losing vegetation at an astounding rate around the globe. We need to incentivize people to clear less, not to clear land, to, you know, change their practices when they're farming, so there's less tillage happening. And that's why we need this net accounting, so that we can incentivize farmers to change their management practices. And I don't know, I just think that it will help us better understand the programs that we can get more support for if we're doing the net accounting.
Thanks, JL. I don't want to spend the entire time on this, but I do think this is really helpful. So maybe just another quick round of like, you know, quick hits about how we're going to have this conversation going forward. Ryan, you're up, and then the room, and then Chris.
Thanks very much. This does not need more research, in my opinion. This needs to be implemented as ICF recommended. The agricultural sector, right, 4 years since the Global Warming Solutions Act was introduced, to get to, in April of 2024, the final report from ICF, because during that time, we've lost hundreds of farms, almost 10,000 cows, and a lot of acres of cropland. Right? Agriculture is the only land use that is losing footing in the state of Vermont. And there is an incredible opportunity in agriculture for reductions. Sequestration, right? Net sequestration between all of the agronomic practices that the state funds has real, tangible reductions, and they are cost effective. Making sure that agriculture is measured against a scale that is designed for agriculture is appropriate, and it's not held to a yardstick that fossil fuel sectors are held to, right? This is a biologic sector. The emissions in the sector come from livestock. And the emission reduction opportunities that exist in transportation, heating, right? There are options where fossil fuel doesn't have to be used, right? No emissions, right? Agriculture is different. It needs its own measurement system. That is what the RFP set out to ask, and the answer is unequivocal. It does not need more study. It needs to be implemented, in my view. We can't waste any more time on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Jane or whoever's in the room.
I guess I just wanted to propose a recommendation or a path forward here. There's a lot of things being alluded to. There's the study, which I'm not sure if folks fully understand, but that study also looked at ways that we could improve upon our gross emission accounting for agriculture with changes that we could make to the SIP module with EPA permission. And we have made some of those changes and are working with Ag to further refine the way we account for gross emissions in the inventory for the next inventory coming out later this spring towards June. So there's that, and then there's the net emissions questions, and the net emission question for the ag sector comes into play in multiple different statutes, including the GWSA and others. So there are legal questions and some blurriness, I might suggest, around that I think the council would want to understand. And then, as Jared's alluded to and others, in changing, if there was to be a change around the ag emission sector for net emissions, there would be an impact on other sectors, their proportional share, and there are other components of that. So my comment question to all of you is that there's a lot here that could be boiled down, and just dealing with the question of net versus gross is maybe simplistic. And so would ask that if this recommendation is one that has been lifted up and the council wants to dive into more, to consider where and how the learning moves forward. So Jared put in the chat the Science and Data Subcommittee. That was a similar sort of recommendation that came out of the last climate action plan, when a recommendation out of Ag and Eco around biomass had a lot of implications that touched other jurisdictions. There was need for involvement with other subcommittees or expertise. I would argue this is the same for this. And so it's either we could have that joint conversation, or that same kind of joint knowledge expertise sits at the Climate Council, and we could talk about it with everything on the table at another meeting if this is a recommendation that folks want to pursue and consider for the next climate action. So I guess I just wanted to signal that there's a lot happening here and there's some process stuff. And so maybe, David, if we could pivot to sort of asking, one, if this recommendation is something that folks want to consider clearly for the next climate action plan. If the answer is yes, then discuss where and how that learning is obtained.
Great. Let's do that second part of the question, Jane, right away. It's like, let's think about process here. Would folks like Science and Data to take a pass at this, to sort of play with the implications for other parts of the economy and other parts of the accounting system? Would that be helpful? And then come back and you all can then have the benefit of that conversation your next go around as a council. Does that sound like a reasonable pathway, Jared?
The one kind of contextual question I would have for that conversation is, is there an update in terms of hiring for the staff person who will be leading the greenhouse gas emissions inventory? Because I think it'll be really important that this conversation happen with a clear eye to the data and methodology around the inventory. And while I would be happy to host conversations on this topic in the Science and Data Subcommittee, which is the place where the inventory has been reviewed and discussed, I feel like it would be most productive only when we are doing that with the staff that are tasked to carry that out and are aware of kind of background nuances and considerations.
So luckily, for folks who don't know, the gentleman, Jeff Merrill, who did the greenhouse gas inventory prior to Colin Smythe, he's on contract with us right now, and he is updating our inventory for this coming year. So we have contractual help with Jeff Merrill. And again, Jeff Merrill did the inventory for a number of years as a state employee, is now working on contract. And he's actually the expert on the ag sector and the ag accounting, and was very much involved with Colin on the study with ag and others. So Jeff is around and can help support that learning, and he will help support the transition of the hiring of the new climate change analyst who will do the inventory as well as other responsibilities in the office.
Okay, great. So just quickly, folks okay with this sort of pathway? Science and Data takes a bite at this and then brings it back to you as a full council, and then you can look at this bigger story like what Jane said? That sound like a good plan? I saw there's interest in seeing Ryan's slides as well. We can circulate those. Okay, let's do that. Thanks. It's complicated, right? All right, so the other piece on this, the two pieces, one was about biomass and the other was about the sort of the way we do technical education in Vermont. I'm curious, I feel like biomass has a little more energy in there to talk about for a moment. So I think I'm going to start there and then we can work on that last one. But I think it might be helpful for new counselors just to get a quick overview of this. And Jane, I wonder if you want to help me with this, or I can do it for a moment, but just an overview of how this conversation of biomass has happened with the council over the last few years and the addendum that was created about 12 months ago. Jane, do you want to do that? Do you want me to do that quickly?
Happy to talk about it from a process standpoint.
Yeah.
So for the first climate action plan, Ag and Ecosystems recommended a number of recommendations around biomass. Those were put together through a task group of Ag and Eco, and because of the timeline in putting together the initial climate action plan, Ag and Ecos as a subcommittee did not have time to take in those task group recommendations and lifted them up to the full council without subcommittee review. As a result, the Climate Council itself said, this is a complicated issue. It wasn't vetted fully at the subcommittee. It also has interjurisdictional sort of subcommittee touch points, and only Ag and Eco was contemplating recommendations. So the Climate Council decided to defer those recommendations and ask that a task group come together that was comprised of science and data, cross-sector mitigation, and Ag and Eco to revisit those initial cut at recommendations that Ag and Eco only task group put together, revisit those, lift up a set of recommendations to the full Climate Council to consider. That happened roughly 2 years ago. And then the Climate Council, you all took those initial recommendations from that cross body and further cut those. I believe they were roughly 7 recommendations that came up from that task group. And the Climate Council decided to advance 2 recommendations as an addendum to the Climate Action Plan. We can drop those in the chat, a link to those in a second so you can see what was approved. The Climate Council just did that a year ago, and those 2 recommendations signaled the need to do a study in large part, and then ask that the PUC consider the findings of that study once the study is complete, I think is the two recommendations largely. That study's never been funded or acted upon. It's been requested, but we've never received funding for it. And so we have not done that study. As a result, I think the Ag and Eco Subcommittee decided to take biomass up again. And there are new recommendations that both point to fund that study, as well as further look at what happens with biomass in this interim period before the study is completed.
Perfect. Thanks, Jane. That is very helpful summary. I just threw in the chat that sort of what the council did in December 2023. And so as I showed earlier on the screen, the subcommittee, most of the folks in the meeting where they were deciding on the priority recommendations to present to you as council, most folks felt represented by that first line that I showed. I can show this one more time. Hang on one sec. Most folks in that meeting in the science, excuse me, in the Ag and Ecosystem subcommittee felt represented by this line, which is essentially saying, do the study, and in the meantime, don't approve any new biomass utility scale electricity facility, energy facilities. However, not everybody felt represented by that. And some folks wanted to go further, and some folks wanted to just stick to what the addendum says, which is do the study, and the Public Utilities Commission should be looking at the issues that are the sort of terms of reference of that study as it's considering anything in the meantime. Okay. Several of you clicked on this as like, hey, we need to talk about it. And I think I understand why, because it's a little confusing what the actual recommendation is coming out of the subcommittee. I'm interested, I showed you some comments that you all made. Some of those comments came in, said, oh, actually, I feel more represented by this than anything else. I'm curious, council, how you want to have this conversation this time around. Do you want to do something? Do you think it's worth spending some time going beyond your current addendum? If so, like, what kind of conversation do you want to have about that? Any thoughts? Rich?
We debated this and considered it really carefully when we created the addendum, and I think sticking with that, which I think is the third of those three bullets, would be the way to go. I don't think we have the information we need to direct the PUC to adopt a moratorium.
Okay. Thanks, Rich.
And I guess it's worth noting, I don't see that there's much demand for building new facilities anyway for electric generation using biomass. There might be some confusion about whether that language would apply to cogeneration for thermal networks in Burlington, in which case then, we would kind of be entering into a, giving a recommendation with respect to a specific project for which we don't have all the information.
Thanks, Rich. Okay. Would others want to have more of a conversation about biomass than, say, Richard's suggestion? Thank you, David.
Oh.
Yeah, and there was yeah, and I think for folks, Jael, others who are in the subcommittee, there was concern that there was a facility that was being proposed, and there were some others that were potentially proposed would follow on if that one got approved. So I think it felt live for some folks in the subcommittee, and that's why there was this urgency that some members felt. Jared?
I mostly have a process kind of question on this and a reflection to offer related to it. And that is, as I think about what the Climate Action Plan is, it's a document that is co-authored and signed off on and voted on by the 23 members of the Climate Council. And so, I'm comfortable having linking to, you know, the notes or to information that says how subcommittee members felt about a particular issue. But I think at the end of the day, it would be really unclear to just include, you know, there's a subcommittee that fell into 3 different camps. I think we need to figure out as a council, what are we comfortable standing behind, and putting in the cap. So to me, when I flagged this, it was mostly because it felt unfinished.
Yes.
And I think that that's helpful information, what different members of that subcommittee felt, but we need to figure out what we're going to say as a council officially in the cap.
Completely agree, Jared. Yeah, and I definitely don't want to signal like, oh, the cap will have some like thing from the subcommittee. No, you all as counselors need to express the way you want to express it. Yeah. Yeah. So at a bare minimum, we need to do that. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on biomass? Okay. So the final one is about that updating or changing the way that sorry, I keep getting my notes sideways on this, on the way education and technical assistance happens. For folks who remember reflecting on that and having some concerns about it and saying, I don't think this is what we should be doing. Folks, do you want to say a little bit about that? And I will find the place here in the document where we talk about it. Anyone want to talk about that one right now? It's about how, let me pull it up. I'll put the exact language in the chat if you give me 1 second. Julie?
I'm one of the people that flagged that. I just feel like this is a really big conversation that's going to be taking place at the legislature around school education finance, and probably I see Sarah's back and may be best positioned to speak to it. And I just worry we're going to get sucked into a vortex if we try to have a climate angle on this. I don't feel like this is the place to spend our time and energy, given all of the other really meaty topics we've discussed so far today, and just worry that this is kind of a too far afield and so complicated and thorny. It could really distract from work that only the Climate Council is doing, as opposed to work others are engaged in. I don't know, Sarah, if you have more meat to put on those bones.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I that was, being new to the council, that was my initial reaction as well when I saw this in the climate action plan. And so I will tell you that there will be a robust discussion about this topic in other venues during this legislative session. And so my reaction would be, I'm not sure that it has to be here with the Climate Council, because it will be ongoing in other venues.
Thanks both for those comments. I see quite a bit going on in the chat as well. And I mischaracterized where this came from. This came from the cross-cutting education recommendations. That's where this one came from. It didn't come out of Ag and Eco. Okay. So just to be, I'm always looking to see if there's any other views that I just want to see if, because it sounds so far what I see in the chat and the comments made verbally, there's not a lot of interest in getting deep in on this. There's more of interest in saying, there's going to be other venues to deal with this. It's probably not us. Any pushback on that, David?
No, not pushback. I mean, I think at the core of, or the essence of this recommendation is the need to have more funding for workforce development. And so, I assume there's probably a more broad general support for that. So, we get to talk about specific revenue sources, and particularly when you dive into property taxes, you're in, in third rail territory. But I hope we don't lose that essence of the recommendation.
Thanks, David. So it does raise a question whether, as a council, you want to say something more broadly about workforce development. That's going to be fundamental for doing the kinds of transitions and things you are suggesting in this plan. Rich?
Well, the cross-sector committee has been asked to consider a cross-cutting recommendation concerning workforce development for, loosely speaking, climate workforce, in particular in the buildings and thermal arena. And so cross-sector has looked at this, and it seems to me that it would be sufficient for our purposes, because we are recommending support for a weatherization and HVAC training center. It would be sufficient simply to add a sentence that, of course, we would like those initiatives to have the financial support they need to succeed, just as a general statement. We don't have to talk about restructuring education finance writ large in order to make that statement.
Okay. Does that address, for instance, like Secretary Moore and others, like the concerns that you've had to have a statement that's more along those lines of like, provide the resources to do the hubs and stuff that we're suggesting?
Yeah, I guess personally, I think if it was more focused on workforce development and less focused on education finance, would be probably go a long way towards addressing my concerns. I think it's just sort of getting us tied into education finance in a prominent way through one of our priority recommendations doesn't seem like the right strategy at this moment.
Thank you. Yeah, and Jael's noting that this workforce is a relevant thing for other areas. Okay, so it sounds like maybe there's a shift here that needs to happen around workforce development and how you want to express something that doesn't get you bogged down in something where the primary conversation is happening in a different venue. Okay. All right, so that's giving us a window of how we can touch in on some of these priority recommendations. That's work we're going to need to do in subsequent meetings. Thanks everyone for providing that input. We're capturing this in notes. We'll have that to help prep up the next time we get into these. We wanted at this point to talk about writing and the work ahead. And Jane, I'm happy to turn it entirely over to you, or if you want me to share my screen with the document, whatever's easier, more convenient for you.
Yeah, I don't seem to have, I wanted to share it because I wanted to share a PowerPoint, but.
I have that handy here if you want it.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping to share it from PowerPoint rather than Adobe just because of the sizing, but this is
Oh,
fine.
sorry.
That's okay. Thank you for pulling it up. So let me just start by saying that we are, for new counselors, we are in the throes of, as you've heard, trying to develop a draft climate action plan by the end of March. As a reminder, this effort is being undertaken so that we could have something comprehensive to go out with to the public when we hold our 8 to 10 sessions in April, roughly, to talk with folks about what the recommendations are in the plan. Today's conversation isn't to really go through each of those chapters, but I would encourage you to look at the document online that shows the breakdown of the updated climate action plan that you all as counselors have previewed and the steering committee continues to invest in, thinking about. But today is really to get us on the sort of same page about what the expectations are for drafting and what the body of the climate action plan will look like this time around. Somewhat different from, we hope, somewhat different from the initial climate action plan. So want to just talk through that. And then this is a precursor to what I hope would be further guidance for some of the folks who are leading drafting chapters. So Liz and others have been going out and talking with many of you to think about who is the appropriate counselor to lead drafting of chapters that are centered around recommendations. So you'll have support from the Climate Action Office to draft administrative and technical analysis chapters. So chapters that we can give a first pass to that are really sort of more straightforward analysis chapters we will do. But the chapters that are really the sort of need the sort of voice of the council around recommendations, we now largely have a counselor in charge of for every one of those. And that is provided for in that document that's also linked on the page for today's meeting. So counselors will lead those drafting chapters. It's their responsibility to sort of ask for help or support from subcommittees or state staff if they need it. But understanding it's unclear what that full breadth of support is needed from all of those counselors. It's hard to know where we'll be able to match people up, but hope to be able to provide help where and if needed. Today's conversation will hopefully maybe also make people not so anxious about what we expect in those chapters, so maybe you won't need as much help as you think you do. So in the climate action plan, all the work you're doing right now around priority actions, those top actions, that's sort of the actions we plan to detail in the body of the CAP. Those 250 or so other actions that you've been working on, which you'll take up at your next meeting, we don't intend to pull those into the body of the CAP. We're really trying to tell a compelling story this time and really lift up those actions that are key to move on in the next 1 to 2 years that really show the body of work to address climate outcomes that we want to see on the ground. So that's not to say those actions go away, but there'll be an appendix. And what we've been thinking about is how to create a streamlined document where someone can go right to the climate action plan page, climate action plan web page, and just click on a document that's nicely formatted, compiled, where you can pull those priority actions, but also all the recommendations in the CAP in one cohesive document. The specific chapters, those chapters entitled transportation or resilience in the natural environment, we are trying to ask you as key authors to keep those chapters to like 3 to 5 pages. So we don't want a document, again, that's 250 pages that is, hard for people to get the gist of. Those chapters related to transportation, buildings and thermal, et cetera, are really needed to just tell an overarching story of the work needed in that sector and to be a place where you can highlight your priority actions. What are those top actions needed to move the needle? And that's where we really hope to give you some specific guidance so you know what you're putting in those chapters in the next 1 to 2 weeks. And your feedback today will be really helpful in that space. You might remember in the last plan, for those of you who have been lucky enough to be around for 2 plans now, Marion and I had a really detailed document that talked about font size and line numbers and things that help people edit. And we'll probably do something similar again this time. Next slide. So most of those chapters are going to be developed by March 1st for formatting and work throughout March by all of you. Those lead authors will need to be available ultimately then again in May to incorporate public comments from events in April. We also think that will likely be a space where subcommittees should be able to provide some technical guidance on any recommendation changes that might be anticipated or conceived of through those public conversations. There are some additional chapters like executive summaries and some technical analysis that won't be done. You'll see that in the document linked on the website. Those will be done hopefully by June 2nd. We'll have capacity in the CAO through a contract we expect. Through CPRG, you all recall that this funding, this plan is tied specifically also to a deliverable in this climate pollution reduction grant of our comprehensive climate action plan. So we have some capacity to support copy editing this time. So we really want to be striving to have a whole draft revised based on public comment by June 2nd. And then have a cooperative process with all of you as the authors to ensure those edits are reflecting what you want to say in your voice. So we are striving to adopt the plan on June 16th. Even with June 16th as the date, we're going to lose David because David has some fun plans in June. And so, but our hope is that like the last time, it's not July 1st where we're actually editing the plan as we're trying to adopt it. We're really working to have a full draft by June 2nd, adopt by June 16th, and we have a little bit of a buffer to breathe and make any last minute changes in the month of June. So I want to put this out there because we are striving for a more concise plan this time, something that people can really pick up and use. Who has a vacation? Yes, David has a vacation. He's actually already on vacation. But that's the way the schedule is working out. And we're hopeful that folks are sort of on board with the idea of a plan that's more readable and usable by Vermonters. That's our goal. And if you have challenges in that, that's not the way you think we should strive to do that, I welcome comments and feedback now. Yeah, and look forward to putting out some more thoughtful guidance for folks who have graciously taken on leading chapters. So thanks.
Super. Okay, any questions for Jane on this? Any reactions about the ambition here?
Just quickly, we put this together, but this has been cooperative with the steering committee, so it's not just Jane's vision, it's the steering committee's vision. So I do want to say.
And there's another linked document in the I believe there's another in our page for today. It has the writing assignments document, right?
I'll drop that in the chat while you facilitate.
Yeah. Okay. Anything, folks? Reactions? Liz Miller.
Hey, and I am a steering committee member, although I wasn't able to attend last week's meeting because of travel. So I will apologize for that. As I say that this looks good in terms of overall structure and pacing, except just putting it out there and maybe reflecting some comments much earlier in the meeting just for us to chew on. I'm just wondering whether, knowing that we have this July 1st statutory deadline, pretty clearly stated in the statute is required every 4 years on July 1st, we nevertheless want to consider a shift of possibly a month or something like that in what we're looking at for these deadlines. I've thought about that as I was listening to everyone talking over the last couple of hours about these really meaty topics and about the legislative schedule that we're all looking at. Many of us are actively involved in, many of you are actively involved in. So I'm putting it out there as something to consider, and knowing that we're coming up to an in-person meeting, it may be worth talking about that in person with one another, just in good faith, whether there's a way to both meet the statutory deadline and create some more breathing room, because putting together a draft by March 1st in light of everything we've talked about today and what's going on otherwise doesn't feel as realistic to me as it did. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah. Chris?
Sorry. Yeah, I would agree. Not trying to put anything off, but having been on the council before we did the first draft, now trying to squeeze in the drafting of the second, especially with all the potential other dynamics going on out there. It just, I think it would be good to talk about this at the end of the month, about what really makes the most sense, not only for the council, but for Vermont. So I would support that.
Thanks, Chris. Well, clearly it's coming in as an agenda item for 2 weeks from now. Other reflections, listening to Jane and the what's coming out of the steering committee conversations? Anything else? Okay. All right. Jane, anything else on your end for that?
Nope, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, great. And thanks for dropping in the chat the writing responsibilities document. Okay, so next steps. We will be meeting in person. I don't know, Liz Amler, if we have a location 100% locked in.
Not yet. Working on it.
Okay, great. But assume it'll be in the Montpelier areas. And so we'll see you then. Before then, you'll be receiving a pretty meaty packet of Excel documents, which will be the full output of the subcommittees and all the recommendations. And like yes, we will have some reading time at that meeting in person. And that meeting in person will be so much more constructive and productive if folks can dedicate a little bit of time. So it's on us to make sure we get that to you in a reasonable time frame, which in my mind is a week before. Welcome thoughts on that. And it's helpful if folks can dive into that as we do that. Chris?
Should we consider an alternate inclement weather date too, in addition to this 27th?
Oh, that's a nice idea.
And the other thing I would just ask, some of us have a couple hours drive up to Montpelier. So an 8 o'clock start time wouldn't be very much appreciated, but something a little later. I may come up the night before anyway, just because sometimes to hedge my bets with the weather, I just do that. But just be thoughtful about not everybody's within a quick driving range of Montpelier. So
Great. So maybe like a 9:30 start and a 3:30 finish kind of thing?
something like that, yeah.
Okay, great, helpful. Okay. Another point, Chris? No, you got that. Okay. All right, folks, I think we're finishing up. Jane, am I forgetting anything around next steps or anybody? Am I forgetting anything about next steps? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for doing this one on Zoom. We look forward to seeing you in person. We will structure up with the steering committee a great agenda and good use of our time together. And can't wait to see you all in person. And thanks especially for our new members for jumping in, as you say, to a moving freight train. So thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.